You've lost a lot. Your cousin, your advisor, your close advisor, your brother and sister, your country, your father.
Iranians have paid a very high price. But I think coming out of the tunnel, we're better for it because we have learned so much more.
I mean, are you disappointed that he's talking about a deal with Iran?
Don't put the carriage before the horse. We first have to get to that element where people are free. Then we'll see what happens.
Are you ever scared of your own safety?
I've never been scared because it's a price I'm willing to pay. At which point do we say enough is enough? Light always ultimately triumphs over darkness.
It's May 29, 2025. This is Roqe. Hi there, welcome to episode 374 of Roqe. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Hello to you from Toronto. Hello to you from Canada. Salam Dustan Aziz. Durud bar shoma. Hope you are doing well wherever you are tuning in from around the world. This is a special edition of Roqe. This past weekend, we were joined in the Roqe Studio by a guest whose presence carries both historical weight and contemporary resonance, a figure known to every Iranian around the world, regardless of generation or geography. And the man who walked through our doors is someone many have known by name since childhood. He was the heir to the throne of Iran. Today, he remains a powerful symbol for many of unity, of possibility, of a country still searching for its future. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi sat down with us for one of his first ever in-studio interviews in Canada, and certainly one of the most candid and wide-ranging and real conversations we've had on this program. Over the course of more than an hour, the interview runs about 75 minutes. We spoke about everything from policy to personal loss, from protest movements to Pink Floyd, from legacy to leadership, criticism to hope. At times it was emotional. At times it even got a little combative, but always grounded in a shared commitment to speak openly about Iran, about the path forward, about what it means to carry history while still trying to shape the future. We're going to give you this full interview unedited from this weekend. But before we get to that, let me just mention, for all things related to Roqe, back episodes, videos, guests, information, funnies, photos, you can go to our website, roqemedia.com. It's the hub of all things Roqe, roqemedia.com. You can listen to this program as a podcast, as you may know, on Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, CastBox, and more. You can watch it on YouTube. We also put up clips on Instagram and Telegram. We invite you to follow and subscribe on all those platforms. If you do go to our website, roqemedia.com, you can support what we do as totally independent media by becoming a Patreon member or just providing a donation of any kind. Just click on the support button on the main page of our website, roqemedia.com. This episode is brought to you with the support of Beghi Law. Beghi Law Firm is a full-service law firm providing litigation and immigration services, and your trusted partner for comprehensive legal solutions in Canada and beyond. They're located in the heart of Richmond Hill in the Greater Toronto area. Thank you to Beghi Law. All right, let's get to our feature interview on this special edition. This is Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi on Roqe. All right, let's get to our feature interview today, and it's a significant one. Sitting with me in the Roqe Studio today is someone whose name has echoed through the decades of modern Iranian history, often with complexity, sometimes with controversy, and increasingly with renewed relevance and reverence. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi was once heir to the throne of Iran, the eldest son of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He was 17 years old when his family left Iran amidst the upheaval of the 1979 revolution. And in the decades since, he has lived in exile, carrying both the legacy of his family and the weight of a country in flux. But in recent years, and particularly in the wake of the Women Life Freedom uprising, his role in the Iranian consciousness has undeniably shifted. His name has been chanted in the streets by new generations of Iranians, many of whom didn't grow up with the monarchy but see him as a potential symbol of unity in a fractured political landscape. At the same time, his message, a consistent call for secular democracy, human rights, peaceful transition, has found fresh resonance both inside Iran and outside. Some would say his reemergence into the spotlight has not only been remarkable, but perhaps inevitable. In this conversation, perhaps we can explore the arc of that reemergence. We'll talk about vision and strategy, about personal loss and national purpose. Perhaps we can talk about his critics, as well as his recently announced five-point plan for Iran, and how he views the challenges ahead, including the possibility of renewed nuclear negotiations, the role of the diaspora, and his position on issues that stir intense debate within the Iranian global community. At the same time, hopefully we'll have time to discuss everything from AI to Pink Floyd. It's a pleasure to welcome Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi to the Roqe Studio. Hello, sir.
Thank you, Jian, for having me on your program.
It's very nice to have you here. Well, first of all, welcome back to Canada. Welcome back to Toronto, arguably the new epicenter of all things Iranian diaspora. You have to come with more regularity now. You know that.
Well, I had over the years. I mean, I've been coming to Toronto quite many times from many years ago, and I can see the evolution of the Iranian diaspora here and their impact and the importance of their role, particularly as we talk about how much every Iranian who is now a citizen of Canada or the US or other countries, the role that they can play in making sure that their respective host countries and their governments are sensitive to the ask of our fellow compatriots back home.
I don't know if you've been north on Yonge Street in Toronto, if they've showed you the plazas that are entirely of Iranian, people of Iranian descent. It's quite a remarkable shift for those of us who've been here for a long time to see the evolution of the diaspora here. You may need a residence here to so that we can see you more regularly in this epicenter. As I was saying in the introduction there's lots I want to cover with you, both personal and policy. Let's start with the breaking news of this weekend. Trucker protests, strikes going on in Iran, disrupting supply chains, logistics. It seems like the regime's handle on basic infrastructure is increasingly unstable. What do you make of these trucker strikes this weekend in Iran?
Well, first and foremost, I would like to emphasize the fact that, and it has always been my overall methodology in how do you fight against the regime that is extremely repressive at home and until now has been, of course, the obstacle between Iran's having a better life and better future and be reconnected to the free world. And I always believed in the approach being one of civil disobedience and non-violence as a method. Mm-hmm. And I think we are coming to realize more and more how effective once society organizes itself in protest, in strikes, a method that is the least possible cost as opposed to other scenarios of violence and conflict that also achieve its desired results. I think the element that will bring ultimately the regime to its knees, a regime that is becoming more and more weak, demonstrates that. And of course, at the same time, the problems that society is facing today, the economic struggles and hardship that Iranians are facing, all of this ultimately manifests itself in the form of strikes at the beginning. And I always maintain that ultimately, if we are able to successfully orchestrate nationwide strikes that paralyzes the regime, is the quickest way to force it to ultimate collapse. That's the way to do it. And today we see that irrespective of which sector of society you represent, whether you're a truck driver or people who are in charge of baking bakeries, whether you are a teacher or somebody working in hospitals, or in every aspect, people who are now basically the retired community, and every one of them have their own respective reasons to have hardship. How can we galvanize Iranians who may not necessarily represent any of these entities, but how do they come to the support of those who are now taking the risk of
how do you gauge these trucker strikes, for example, what that means in the broader context of how close we are to that ever elusive precipice of change, of complete upheaval? In other words, depending on who you ask, as you probably know, coming out of Iran, they'll say, look, it's chaos. People are desperate. The economy's terrible. It feels like change is in the air. Or I know people who come and go from Iran that I've spoken to who say, "Khabari nist, there's nothing going on. Yes, sure, people are unhappy, but I don't see any evidence that anything's going to change soon." How do you gauge where we are in the big picture?
It's been often said, if you look at various factors of fundamental change in different countries at different times, there is a general guideline that says if 3.5% of the entire society of any given country is mobilized for that fundamental change, that's the secret magic number to attain in order to do that. Iran is a country of 90 million people. And if you say, what is the 3.5%? That represents probably anywhere between 2-3 million people that, if mobilized and organized, they can in fact make the difference. I'm not saying it should be only that level. I think it's much more. But I think we already have more than enough people affected as a result of this regime at a state of desperation. When they've had it, they simply cannot continue. It's not just because of economic hardship, it's that the basic necessities that society has to depend on to function is not even there.
But we have been saying that for a while.
But we are seeing now more and more evident. The electrical shortages, blackouts, everything that affects the fact that people have to close down their shop. They can't pay salaries. They cannot earn their living. All of these is an escalation in problems that is now manifesting itself to the point that they have to take the next step. But obviously, at the end of this, we have to see what's the culminating point. I think we are seeing two things: the economic factor, of course, but it's also the people realizing more and more that we can no longer see a sustainable situation, that this regime has run out of any possible excuse it had so far in the sort of reformist discourse that has lasted all these years and helped the regime somehow survive. Even former reformists today believe that there's no way we can bring a change from within. We have to go beyond this regime.
But will we know when it's the time? I mean, many people, if you take the clock back 2.5 years, at the height of the protests after the killing of Mahsa Amini, many people legitimately thought, well, this is the time. This is it. Did you think that?
It was certainly the next phase in the level of the struggle. Every struggle of this type have its ebbs and flows. It's not the first time we see this, and just because one movement hasn't succeeded doesn't mean that it's the end of the story. Movements have come and gone and continues. The Green Movement was one. The Mahsa Revolt was one. But it is sustainable and continuing. Why? Because the ultimate solution is to put an end to this regime. People know that. The question is, how do we achieve that? What do we need to do in this phase? And then what happens next? And I think that's very important because people understand that the reason why they are in this mess is because you have this corrupt ruling mafia that represses with no pity and sustains itself. And unfortunately, in the case of Iran, this regime has been thrown far too many times a lifeline by foreign factors where it had its back to the wall. Let's see, for example, at the time where the pressure was brought on the regime, it was on retreat. But some administration come in play. They allow the regime to have access to the revenue they should not have had.
Yeah.
During the Biden administration, $200 billion of oil revenue that the regime should not have had access to. What did it spend it on? It didn't spend it on the suffering, starving people on Iran. It used it to revitalize its proxies. We saw the Houthis in Yemen. We saw Hezbollah and Hamas. As a result of it, we saw elements like October 7th. All of this meaning is that every time the Iranian people were moving one step forward, this regime was given another lifeline somehow.
Well,
So, the struggle has to continue regardless, but there are some factors that can contribute to expediting this process.
okay.
So it's never a situation where we should say, well, because of unfavorable situation, we have to give up the fight. Eventually, the planets will align. I think the planets are now aligned in many different aspects.
The problem is for those who don't believe that we're close to the planets aligning, even as they it may desire change, and I'm talking about those inside Iran. Some of us have family there. We're talking to them. It becomes a prescription for quiescence because we know there's not going to be a change right away. So what can we do? And so it's and I don't want to belabor this because we got lots to talk about, but it's how do we see those trucker protests as another point in this is leading to this is an inflection point versus there's trucker protests in Canada as well. What's the big deal? That.
Because when you are limited in any means of standing up to a repressive regime, you have to start somewhere. And the quickest way to put domestically pressure on the regime is to basically disturb the functioning of the system and paralyze the system by means of non-cooperation, strikes, and what have you. Now, in relevant countries, when you have a labor strike, ultimately it's a matter about wages and this and that. It gets adjusted and life goes on. In the case of Iran, this regime from the get-go did not have the national interest in mind. It didn't do anything for the people. Never done that. It has done everything with the mindset of surviving as a regime for its own interests and using every Iranian resource not to cater to the needs of society, but to use Iranian resources to foment their agenda of exporting an ideology by maintaining an instrument of repression at home, by strengthening their proxies abroad, and basically leading this radical movement as they have for 40 years. And the Iranian people are not the regime. They have said it in many times. Every demonstration, every messages that are, if you read between the lines, when it's addressed to the outside free world in particular, is that unlike this regime, this is a warmongering regime that wants to wipe up a country and a religion off the face of the earth, that is in conflict with them, we, the Iranian people, are on the same value mindset than the very same free world we'd like to be able to have in our own country. We were talking about the Iranian diaspora. How many people who are now members of the diaspora here in Canada had to flee Iran, had to seek refuge? They could have otherwise pursued life in Iran.
You know what
proper.
I would say? I would say actually all of them. All of us in one way or another are here unwittingly.
Exactly.
In some case, they left happily, but with an expectation of perhaps returning, which was squashed in the case of, say, my family. So your point is a profound one, of course. We're all here affected by what's happened in the last 50 years.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have to be here.
Right.
But the thing is that when you deny people the opportunities, you have no choice but to either fight back or to flee. Why should that be the future of Iran? As opposed to eliminating the root cause of why we are in the mess we are and have the kind of national government that, unlike this regime, cares about the people, works for the people, is of the people. And this is our message to the world, that unlike this regime that you're trying to negotiate with, that for 4 decades you have had a strategy of expecting behavior change, not understanding that in its DNA, it cannot, in any form or shape, coexist with the same value system that the free world has. The same values that Iranians want to have for themselves. Freedom of speech, of opportunities, of equality, of non-discrimination of any form, whether sexual, ethnic, or political persuasions. These are the basic core elements.
Let me come back. I want to come back to policy, come back to the news of this weekend, and also come back to the Biden administration. But before we go any further, let me ask about you a little bit, if you'll indulge me. I mean, you sit here in 2025 at this desk as a man in great demand. There are thousands of people, there are crowds everywhere you go with a desire to hear what you have to say. media want to talk to you. You're at the center of the zeitgeist, you might say. And with great respect, that wasn't always the case. That hasn't always been the case. There was a long time when you were, by some, dismissed as exiled, as distant, as in the wilderness somehow. How does it feel now, after everything, to be called on by so many Iranians once again?
I think my track record and the reason why today's Gen Z connects with my vision and my ideas is because what I believe in is exactly what they hope to have one day. And I started this at a time, as you said, where it was a different set of circumstances. There was no element of social media or platforms that people can have access to information the way we do now. So remaining aware of what's happening, getting more getting to know the person better by means of more direct interaction than have to rely on classic medias, all of that helps a two-way communication. And I think that connection and that track record puts me in a position that today they understand not only the vision that I have for the country, but what it means for them.
But how does it feel?
And why is it that they
how
relate that
feel?
I could be? Well, it feels, sort of a validation of some form that all these efforts I put in is now paying its dividends. Because I started very alone in this struggle.
You did. You started arguably in 1979 in Cairo saying, I will always be there for the Iranian people. And you've been quite consistent. And they're chanting your name now in Iran. I mean, we see these videos of people in soccer stadiums and stuff. Not just your grandfather's name or your father's name, your name. Mm-hmm. You said it feels like validation. Does it feel like vindication?
No, I never thought of vindication as being, everything that has a negative component to it. We come from a culture, I would say it in Farsi, pendar nik, guftar nik, kirdar nik. There's a reason why Iranians today go and celebrate around Cyrus the Great's tomb, a sense of national revival. What is our identity? Who are we as Iranians? How do we look at each other? This regime, as a result of its discrimination, has created a whole host of problems. Women's rights, minority rights, so on and so forth. The Iran that I grew up with in my era as a teenager, I remember vividly that there was never an issue where society was so compartmentalized or atomized as a result of this regime. I remember as a kid, I had the privilege as the Crown Prince to have opportunities to play with our heroes in the national Iranian soccer team. And they were representing different parts of the countries. There were Azerbaijanis, there were Kurds, there were Baluch, there were so on and so forth.
But you're also
there
human.
Were different religions.
You're human.
Yeah.
And for a guy who's been at this for 45 years or more, who some people called out for, or called, he's out of the game, he's not, he's for a few years, to have people chanting your name, it's not vindication, but it's gotta feel like
it's the greatest honor and at the same time sense of duty when there's so much trust that they put in you to play that role for them. And I think that makes me even more compelled to take action and to accept.
But the flip side is, does it feel like more pressure now that you're at the center? Not that you haven't been under pressure for a long time, but now that you're at the center of things, is there any element at all? I mean, if you be Roqe, if you can, is there any element of I mean, 20 years ago when I was doing policy statements for academic lectures and things like that, it didn't feel like it does today, where every word, every moment is captured and the focus is on you. How do you handle that?
Well, there's more pressure as a result of being in the limelight and more scrutiny, more questioning. But, when from day one you set your goal, and the goal being Iran deserves better than a religious theocracy. That instead of us being today the South Korea of the Middle East, we have become the North Korea of the Middle East. Not because Iran lacks natural resources, nor lacks in terms of human ingenuity and expertise.
We could be out Dubaiing Dubai.
Definitely, but why are we where we are today? it's because of ultimately an extremely corrupt mafia-like system that has, at the expense of the people of Iran, drove us near the precipice. We can see that Iran, a different Iran, an Iran that has a national government that cares about its citizens before anything else, that services. That's the job of any government, unlike this regime. That's where the opportunities are created. That's when you can bring people a sense of belonging and participation by guaranteeing their political rights, their freedoms, democracy, human rights. Just not a slogan.
But the question is about you're very good at deflecting questions about yourself. And I think that's it's admirable.
I'm part of this process.
The question was about pressure,
the
pressure that you feel.
Well, I mean, I think everybody, irrespective of what they do, when they're called upon any task, obviously there's pressure with it, but you accept it gladly, because that means that you can have an impact. You can play a role.
It is a choice. Forgive me for cutting off there. It is a choice. And a choice that I think many appreciate, that you make. You did an interview last year, and the interviewer asked you if you could ask your father one question, what would you ask him? And you said, was it worth the risk? And you were referring to, was it worth the risk to push ahead with the progressive policies of the 1970s, et cetera, when you knew there could be backlash, or when it could possibly, of course, not end up where it did, but it could be unfavorable. And it occurs to me that's a question we could ask you, or you could ask yourself, is it worth the risk? Because there is a version of what you could be doing, a version of what you do in a much safer way. You could be issuing pronouncements on Twitter and not really going anywhere, and playing a grandfatherly role or a fatherly role. You choose at this point to be out there, and you do that at risk on a number of levels, including having security everywhere you go. Tell me about that choice.
Well, I think the element that ultimately gives people more comfort is that they're not alone in the fight, that they're represented by the kind of leadership that keeps their voice alive and engage into the aspirations that they want to achieve. And to me, the definition of leadership is to represent that desire and translate it and transform it into applicable, executionable plans that leads to that ultimate desire. Because it's one thing to voice your hopes. And I said, what I'm trying to do is to move the needle from hoping for a change to believing that it can happen, that we can make it happen, because we have the resources and the intelligence and the ability and the skills to do it. The reason why we are not a free country, the reason why we have yet to attain that, it's because the obstacle between us and that freedom is this regime. And that's what I was saying earlier, that if today a truck driver or others have come to the realization that ultimately we cannot just sit here and swallow it, we have to do something about it, that sense of resolve and that sense of unity.
The resolve comes with risk.
Of course,
does the Crown Prince ever?
Freedom doesn't come for free.
Are you ever scared of your own safety?
I've never been scared, because it's a price I'm willing to pay for that liberty, for the fact that I don't want to see yet another generation of young Iranians thrown under the bus or deprived of opportunities because they've learned it the hard way. They look back in 1979. What were we comparing ourselves to? We were sending students to come abroad to study, to come back home. They fell into the trapping and the narrative of the Marxists and the Islamists, and ultimately that contributed to what happened in Iran. Because then we were comparing Iran to Switzerland or to Sweden or to America. How many people compared Iran back then to our immediate region and where Iran stood vis-a-vis them? Today, we look at Dubai and we say, why aren't we not Dubai? So, I think now there's a comparative analysis happening too. Most members of today's Gen Z say, why shouldn't we have the same opportunities there? Why shouldn't be able to develop the Iranian
and to be fair, people are putting their lives on the line in Iran in all kinds of ways. In some ways, young women fighting this regime in the streets, etc. Do you have people around you, family or close friends or something, who will ever say, don't go there. You shouldn't make this trip. Be safe. To whom you say, no, I've got to do this.
Well, naturally, a lot of people are concerned. In fact, it's not just friends or people close to me. A lot of average citizens say, first and foremost, we want us to be safe. We need you
and what do you
for
say
the
to
long
them?
run. I said, well, calculated risk is always necessary, but don't get it wrong that if it comes to the point that I'm willing to risk my life for this, I will. But this is a collective struggle. We have an expression in Farsi, yek dast seda nadare. One hand doesn't make it. That's where we have to work together. That's where we have to be able to coordinate efforts. And if I can inspire them to that, if I can be a leader for them to provide them with this transition and to tell them there is light at the end of the tunnel. We have a plan for recovery. It's not just about changing the regime and attaining freedom, but will you eventually be able to put food on the table? And how we're going to achieve that? With the help of whom? That's part of
Perfect
the plan.
segue. Let me get to the plan, because a lot of people say there needs to be an opposition plan. There needs to be a path forward, not just simply opposition to the regime. And you have one, your 5-point strategy. Crown Prince, at the forefront of it has supporting grassroots mobilization inside Iran. How do we do that? Back to what we were talking about, the trucker protests, and if we can make this personal to people inside Iran. Some of us have family there who it's a tough decision that the parents will say, we don't want you to go out on the street. We don't want you to risk your life. We don't want you to be in danger. Of course, we would like change in Iran, but it occurs to many of us that, of course, those people do need to be in the streets, as you said earlier, for that inflection point to come. How do you inspire that?
Well, nobody asked me whether we should go on strike. They did, because it has reached a point that they see that there is a price to pay, but there's a much more bigger price to pay if we don't do it now, because it will be the continuation of more of the same, as even worse. At which point do we say enough is enough? And I think our society has reached that point. This is part of the alignment of the stars and the circumstances, because at the same time, it's not just the people have arrived at this threshold, but the regime is also at its weakest, meaning there's a true opportunity for fundamental change.
But if I understand it correctly, it's not just the truckers that have to be on strike. It has to be the general population supporting the truckers, right?
Of course, and that's one of the first elements that comes into the five-point plan. How can we reinvigorate and support more? Let's say, I can give you a specific example. Yeah. So the truckers said, listen, I come on strike, but how can I survive if at the end of the month my check will be cashed and I cannot support myself if they take my resource? How can people say, okay, you know what, we're going to delay that, we're giving you more respite, we might even give you a break, we might even give you a discount, anything that you can do to help somebody who has taken the risk of going on strike. That sort of reinforcement, that kind of support, and parallel support, not just everybody for themselves, but I think that all of these social movements have to support one another. That creates more unity. That creates more of a national struggle. We are in a national struggle. This is not just a sectarian movement. This is collectively something that ultimately puts us on a track to push this regime over the precipice and finally get rid of them. Hoping, of course, that the world in the middle of all this will have our back, will not abandon us. Not that we are relying on any foreign support. We have to do everything we have to do, but hoping that the world finally says that, look, for 40 years we have given this regime ample opportunities to come clean. They haven't.
Stop enabling them.
Appeasement and containment has not worked. Again, because the root strategy was to expect that their behavior will change. This regime will never change its behavior. On the other hand, for the world that is concerned about nuclear threats, radicalism, terrorism, and all of that, unlike this regime, the Iranian people are not warmongers. They want to be part of the peacemaking equation. They have no quarrels of antagonism to the Jews or Israel or the Arabs or the Saudis or whoever else in the neighborhood and beyond. And their message to the world, by the way, is, look, we're not doing this only for ourselves. We are in fact doing it for the rest of you, because as a result of which a different Iran will be the element that will bring stability, peace, and that opens the gate for prosperity down the line. And that's a win-win scenario. So in this phase, the first thing we need to do is to see how we can strengthen and support as much as we can all these movements at home. And it shifts back then to one other aspect of what the role of diaspora is in all that. The diaspora obviously are like the ambassadors of our country in their respective host countries. They can have a lot of, how can I say, impact on the way their respective governments look at the Iranian situation and respond to it, whether you're a citizen of Britain or France or Germany or Canada and so on and so forth. In fact, Canada is hosting the next G7 meeting. Let me give you a tacit example of how the diaspora can have a role to play in that. America has put the IRGC on the terror list. Canada has subscribed them as well.
Took a while.
The rest of the G7 have not yet. And guess what? The biggest instrument of repression and supporters of this regime at home and abroad has been the IRGC. It's a little bit like the stormtroopers for the Empire in Star Wars. If you actually curtail them, that's one way of declaring this regime.
How far would you go to in speaking to the people in the diaspora? Do you believe it's our duty to stand in solidarity with the people in Iran? If somebody says to you, listen, I moved out of Iran, I don't want anything to do with it anymore, what do you say to them?
Well, I think then they will have a hard time answering those who remain behind inside Iran that, okay, life is better for us now, and by the way, we'll forget about the rest of you. In fact, it means that now they have the ability to speak freely here, as opposed to an Iranian filmmaker who has to face censorship and even are forbidden to continue their work, but they remain there and work hard. There is a built-in expectation for their fellow Iranians now, having immigrated, that now it's your role to have our back. There's an expectation that is there, and I think, you can be completely detached and say, I don't give a damn anymore. Some people may do that, but I think a lot of Iranians, despite the fact that they had to flee the country, despite the fact that they could not have continued being there because of immediate persecution, whether you were Jewish or Baha'i or homosexual or what have you, and you had to find your liberty, elsewhere. We want to regain those liberties so that, regardless of your political opinion, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your sexual orientation, if you're a member of the LGBT community, if you are, a woman who is now second-class citizen, and for all those reasons, I think the very same values that the Iranians cherish, the most natural role of the diaspora, that enjoy these liberties in the countries in which they are now, is to utilize their resources to help their fellow compatriots by impressing upon those host countries and their governments.
Let me ask
to
you about
decide whose side they're on. Are they going to be on the side of freedom-seeking Iranians, or they want to just cut a deal to do business with the current clerical regime?
Perfect. So when it comes to the United States and putting pressure on those governments, the country you live in, many Iranians are around the world. I've been doing this for 5 years. We talk to Iranians around the world. Many were profoundly disappointed with the Biden administration's seeming, again, quiescence when it came to the regime, lack of enforcement of sanctions, seemingly an eagerness to do a new deal. And many were hopeful that there would be quite a change that would come with the re-election of a Trump administration. I mean, we did a whole show on it. Will it make a difference, Trump? And there were, smart Iranians saying this is what we were hoping for. This is what we need. So far, have you seen any difference in a major way between the policies of the Biden administration and the new Trump administration?
I would like to utilize this opportunity to say something broader than just the specific policy of a specific administration.
Okay.
And that is that we don't expect any foreign country or their governments to do anything for our sake as Iranians. They'll do it out of their own national interest. Our point is to tell them and persuade them that helping us actually is good for you. Because if you are hoping to have more regional stability, if you're hoping to have better commerce, you can't do it with a mafia corrupt regime. But imagine a different Iran that will be opening the floodgates for investors and entrepreneurs to come and help rebuild our country. And I've spoken to these kind of people. I've talked to a lot of people who are industrialists, who are entrepreneurs, who have said time and again that the minute the situation changes in Iran, we would love to come there and help rebuild that country and invest seriously. And that's what kickstarts the economy and what have you and so on and so forth. But guess what? I think that many governments in many foreign countries, in Europe and the United States, far more than the political argument, they are pressured by the private sector and their expectation and what they see will be in the better interest. Now, I think President Trump, who thinks more as a businessman than a politician at the end of the day, and says America first, fine. But how can you divest from getting entangled in a region unless you substitute it with something that brings about that stability? Who are your true partners in doing that?
But are you concerned
a regime that you cannot
are
trust?
you concerned that he's talking about a new deal? And I mean, I thought the whole patina of this was that a Trump administration comes in. You talked about the first administration applying the maximum pressure, etc. So far, it's we're not really enforcing the sanctions, and let's do a deal with Iran. And that seems like a continuation of what I mean. The most profound statement that came out of the protests after Mahsa Amini, one solution revolution, was we're done with reform, right? No new deal. It seemed like there was unity around that. Now, I have to be honest, I'm surprised. I'm hearing from some people who walked alongside us in those protests saying, well, if a deal is necessary, the people of Iran are suffering. And how are you responding to that?
In the course of 44 years and counting, since I've been involved in Iranian politics from the very beginning, many administrations have come and gone, each thinking that it could do something different, but all facing at the end the same problem of a regime that you simply cannot tame because it's not tameable. And even the current administration is realizing that perhaps we overthought the fact that this time it will be different. The regime has tactically always retreated under pressure just to buy time. Their whole policy is based on buying time and riding the storm, hoping that
staying in power.
Again they can survive. That has been their ultimate tactic, time and again, irrespective of who is in the American White House or beyond that. Meanwhile, the dynamics that are bringing us to a position of this regime being at its weakest, and therefore the realistic prospect of change this time are better than any time before, despite the fact that some movements did not fully succeed. But it takes sometimes many different revolts that ultimately one of them will be successful. So just because we had the Green Movement and then we had the Mahsa revolt, and just because then it didn't achieve its ultimate goal doesn't mean that we have to give up the idea of fighting. You have to keep on fighting until it is realized. I think, however, today that we will quickly realize that even if it was a matter of saying, okay, we're not going to go straight to conflict, we're going to allow for diplomacy to work. But the other side of the coin is, and that's the part that I intervene by saying, look, you cannot simply say that because diplomacy has failed, and we would probably fail yet again, now we have to go back to the scenario of striking Iran and so on and so forth. And what I've been arguing all these years is that, look, your best partner, your best solution are a people that are taken hostage and enslaved by this regime. This regime doesn't represent them. It doesn't represent their aspiration. The very same people that are, many of them are represented via the diaspora, that would not have been here in the first place, and they would be back in their homelands contributing to their countries. That's the kind of vision that is part of this entire struggle. The vision of finally attaining the freedoms that we've been fighting for, that we were willing to die for. All of these young kids during the mass revolution who were shot in the eye and were killed, they were not crazy.
Have you spoken to President Trump?
I have sent many messages to the administration, and not just the American administration, but other leaders.
You haven't had a chance to speak to him?
I haven't had the chance to meet him personally yet. Again. No, I haven't.
And how do you, I mean, are you disappointed that he's talking about a deal with Iran?
I think that he too, like many of his predecessors, will realize that the complexity of the Iranian scenario cannot be so easily simplified in thinking that you can sit at a table. Look, we've seen that the regime is dragging its feet. In this latest round of discussion, we saw that it hasn't reached that level that was desired. So I can begin seeing a deflation of that built-in hope into the fact that this deal will be made. My concern is not about the deal that the American administration wants to do. My primary concern is the fate of my fellow Iranian compatriots who are braving the streets without any help, without any support, and yet are willing to sacrifice everything to ultimately liberate themselves. And this is what the world needs to focus on, that their best guarantee of coming out of all these crises and conflicts and security concerns and radicalism and terrorism and all of what you see in the world today is in direct result of the continuing existence of a regime that is fomenting that, as opposed to a nation that say, we want to be at peace with you, we want to be with you, and the only thing keeping us separate from the free world and its values is this regime. So it's time, at least for once after 44 years, for the world to understand that your best hope are the people of Iran themselves, because they will be the changing factor, not the regime by signing some document, but they will bring about that change, and that's good for you. And not just for them. We don't expect them to do it out of compassion, but out of the fact that they see that this partnership will lead to everything.
And part of that, from what I understand, where you go with that is a vision, presenting a vision of the future. Here's what it can look like. And so you've got this Iran Prosperity Project. Is there a brief version of that you can describe for people who, because it's relatively new that you've announced this in the last couple of months, what that means?
There is a plan that will tell people, look, we have all the necessary ingredients to address every issue that our country can recover from, ranging from healthcare, education, banking system, the economy, various strategies of how to do all of that, environmental issues, short term in the immediate, because I think the critical phase will be right after the regime collapse. There's a transition period, so we want to make sure that the economy remains stable, that something crazy doesn't happen. Our short-term plans for that, that's the first initial papers that were produced by those involved in the project is the first phase, but there are multiple phases that will follow: short-term, mid-term, and of course long-term. We are relying on the expertise of our experts both at home and abroad, each of them qualified to opine on their respective fields, offering solutions of how to remedy it, using proven methods that were successful in other countries on how to deal with any of these aspects, and apply the best models that will fit the Iranian agenda. In other words, it's a roadmap, something tangible. So, when you talk about freedom and liberty and human rights, it's like, as the Americans say, motherhood and apple pie. But does it put on the table? Well, how will it impact me, who is the truck driver or a nurse in a hospital, or so on and so forth? What it is that I can know that my life will improve, that I'll be able to feed my children, that will have to have a job, that will have to gain employment, and so on and so forth. This is an entire strategy that can be defined and can be planned for. The simple reason, again, going back to my first point, why are we North Korea instead of South Korea? Because this regime is not incorporating people who actually know what needs to be done, and they're outside of the equation. Because they're just trying to basically suck the blood out of the nation for their own survival and purposes. But imagine if dedicated experts who have plans, who have ideas, who have remedies to all the various challenges that we face as a society, that's how you come back on track. That's how you can reverse this whole cycle.
In terms of the leadership you show on something like the future, the vision, the Iran Prosperity Project, how do you personally, because I'm sure it's important to you, stay in touch with what's going on inside Iran, a country that you haven't been in for 50 years. And in other words, this is one of the things that the critics will say, right? Well, he hasn't been there so how can he know what we can do in Iran? He hasn't been here for 45 years. How do you ensure that you've got your finger on the pulse, even if they are chanting your name?
Right.
You know?
Well, one of the reasons they're chanting my name is because, unlike those who say what you just said, believe that I know what the hell is going on in Iran, because I hear it daily from their own mouths. I talk to people in Iran. I talk to a student. I talk to a doctor. I talk to a nurse. I talk to a mother. I talk to a political prisoner, and so on and so forth. Plus the fact that, as I was saying earlier, a lot of the testimonials that you see in the form of videos, in terms of people sending messages and social media, you see that. I see the truck drivers and what they have to say, or somebody talks about the electricity being cut off, or water shortage. Every aspect, I see that almost like if I was there, if I was in Ahvaz, or if I was in Tabriz, or if I was in Tehran. Just because you're geographically away from there doesn't mean that you don't know what's going on. And, this has been the story of my life. I've been constantly briefed and brought up to speed as to exactly what the situation is. Today is far easier than ever, again, because access to that information becomes much easier with the advent of social media.
Of course.
And you see much more visual and connectivity. I remember when I started, I was in Cairo. You had to wait for a couple of hours just to get an outside line to dial a number from Cairo to, let's say, Paris or London. Today, I can pick up my smartphone, I open my WhatsApp or whatever, and I can have a video chat with somebody sitting in a Mashhad or Abadan. As simple as that. I mean, how else do you communicate? And that means that doesn't matter where in the world I may be, but that means that I am, and because there's such a focus on me, guess who's getting the most information thrown at him? They send it to me.
Yeah.
More than anybody else.
It's about, you have to curate it to a certain extent. You probably have people wading through what you can't read it all. You can't deal with it all.
But it's enough to give you a sense, talking about having the pulse, when you know what the prices of goods are, why people can't afford it, what the shortages are. I mean, it's almost like knowing exactly what, and it's so readily available that it's almost like if you were there. And so, I think maybe some people just want to dismiss you, use this pretext to say, well, he hasn't been there. Well, there are many cases where people haven't been in their countries, but that doesn't mean separation. Because, again, I think that's the difference between those who give up and leave and put that behind and just say, okay, I have a new chapter in my life. Now I am an immigrant to this or that country, and I forget about
that exists too.
But that's the difference between being exiled as opposed to being an emigre, because you're forced into not being there. But
some of us feel that connection so profoundly, and we didn't even grow up in Iran. We grew up outside of Iran. I'm so appreciative that you're here. Thank you for doing this. I can't keep you forever. I know that. I'm just going to ask you a little bit about culture and a little bit about legacy before we end off. You mentioned censorship in film. This weekend was not just the trucker strikes. There's a lot going on. There always is, I guess, when it comes to Iranians in the world. Jafar Panahi, a great dissident Iranian filmmaker, won the Palme d'Or, the highest prize in Cannes. You congratulated him on Twitter, on X. How big a deal is it?
What was his message? What did he say?
In his speech afterwards, or in the film?
In the speech. He used that platform to remind the world about the plight and the desire of Iranians for freedom. Okay, that's when you have the microphone, when you use that stage to remind people what this is all about. And that's the part that we need to connect. Look, I think we need to understand that it's only by defining what is our common national interest, irrespective of having political differences of tastes. But what comes first? We, as Iranians today, have to define what is our ultimate best interest, national interest, collectively speaking, that unites us all in a common goal. It starts with that. Because if you're not united on a cause, doesn't matter what you do, you never reach that threshold of making it happen. It's only when a nation decides to work together for a common cause that they can ultimately overcome the biggest obstacle. The most tyrannical, repressive, totalitarian system were ultimately forced to collapse because the majority of the nation stood together against them. This is the exact situation in Iran right now. The majority of the Iranian people have had it with this regime. They want to go beyond this regime. Yes, not everybody was thinking that way all the time. The biggest divide between those of us who from the very beginning argued, look, this religious theocracy is not Iran's future. But there were reformists who said, no, we have to work with the regime. Even they have given up. So today there's a convergence between former reformists who no longer believe in that, with the rest of us who have always said, okay, why don't we join forces now? This is part of that national unity and reconciliation, so that in the future we can all ultimately achieve what's our collective national interest before we get into party politics and divisions.
But the thing is that arts and culture is a big part of that unity.
Yeah.
You know, in a lot of cases in our community, our global community, it's about reaching back to the songs of Gugush or something, you know, the arts and culture that predated this Islamic regime. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about arts and culture, because you do interviews and you do talks, and there's so many important things to deal with that arts and culture doesn't always get covered. And yet it's massive for a country with such a legacy of poetry and creation and ingenuity. And you know, there's little blips where you go, or little peaks where Jafar Panahi wins the Palme d'Or, the song Azizam comes out, and we have a hit international song for a few weeks or something. But on the other hand, Baraye, beautiful. We have the devastating effects of the Islamic Republic on arts and culture. And you and I once had a long conversation about Pink Floyd, and the last album to come out before the revolution was?
I think it was Dark Side of the Moon.
No, that was 1973.
73 was?
What would have come out in 79
79.
before they closed the music stores? The other big Pink Floyd album. I know you can do this.
Yeah, let me see. Let me think. No, it was not Delicate Sound of Thunder. No, it was before that. It was not Animals. I'm not sure.
No, that's early 70s, late 70s. A song, an album, interestingly enough, about repression.
Give me a hint.
And what's on the wall? Oh, it's The Wall. There, I said The Wall.
Oh, The Wall.
The Wall,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
The Wall
yeah,
came out right. That was the last big album to come out.
That's right.
You earlier talked about that time in the 70s, and I can't tell you the number of people, because we interviewed a lot of musicians and artists and stuff who come on the show, who talk about Iran. I ache to have been there, Crown Prince, to have been experiencing, I mean, once when I was 5 years old for 3 weeks, but to experience Iran of the 1970s, when arts and culture was flowering in a way that I'm not sure to this day it does anywhere else in the Middle East in any decade. Some of it led by your mom. You know, how would you characterize what Iran was in the 1970s as we discuss the loss of arts and culture that happens in the immediate aftermath?
Well, you know, in my days, of course, there was a surge and explosion in creativity in the Iranian pop culture, but also access to foreign art, especially music. Of course, you know, you have to begin seeing more stores in Iran that will sell tapes or vinyl records that you could go and buy and start listening. You know, back then you only had to use, a
record player. Yeah.
And, you know, the Walkman didn't come until very late in the 70s. But, you know, we grew up with cassette tapes and or you know, go on a trip and buy a couple of records in a store in France or elsewhere and bring it back to Iran to be able to play. That's how we all grew up with, you know, listening to records and all that. But, you know, again, I think in the bigger picture, when you see that despite the repression, despite the fact that many Iranians were forced into underground bands to be creative, and yet being so creative despite the restrictions, imagine what they could do once all of those restrictions are removed? How much
Yes.
Iranian culture can
And even all those years, it's
flourish.
like running a race with one leg, trying to find an amplifier so that you could underground play in a rock band, to write songs. I mean, that's so far from the privilege the Western kid would have to be doing.
But you see the when the creativity is there, then you have to make sure that they have access to the means, that they can purchase a musical instrument, or they can have access to a recording studio, or they can have the ability to perform and show their art, no matter what it is, whether you're a painter or you're a musician or whatever. And that's part of Iran's culture. For millennia, we had different way of, but in today's age of technology and ability to, produce something, I think AI will have a lot to do with it. You can be sitting at home and write an entire and produce an entire movie just using the right equipment. That's how much technology is making it even more accessible for artists to express themselves. But before you talk about the technology, you have to create the opportunities.
Yeah.
You have to create the environment that is conducive to even more creativity and more impact. And the fact that when you are under duress and repression, then art takes another form.
Sure.
It becomes the voice of protest.
Sure.
It becomes something that binds the world together because such a group performs such a song in relationship to something that were...
But in terms of Prosperity Project, in terms of looking to the future, one of the things, there's so much to deal with. There's so much to contend with. And when you've suppressed arts and culture, it has all kinds of manifestations. It has all kinds of implications. One of which is, for example, there isn't a proper system of appreciation for intellectual copyright or creative copyright in Iran.
Yeah.
So there may have been great artists over the last 50 years, but they're not getting any royalties for the great book they wrote or the great album. Just that alone, changing that about Iran is mammoth. That itself is a mountain to climb. To socialize the culture, to understand copyright, and to impose the institutions that will ensure that artists get paid, all of that.
I don't think it's so much people not understanding it. They just expect it to be done, and that's the work of legal experts and how you can codify all of this into our laws and have the proper environment that will protect what you said, copyrights and what have you. It's not a complicated thing because models exist elsewhere in the world.
Yes, they do.
That can be easily emulated and replicated in Iran. The point is that these are the nuts and bolts that gives individuals in society, regardless of their field of endeavor, what they need to have their interests protected and their hard work being, in a way, honored and respected. And some it's not just about the creativity, but all the mechanisms of protections. That's why you have labor unions. That's why you have free press. That's why you have NGOs that look after that. That's why you have to bring in, and this is an expertise work. And again, Iran's Prosperity Project, you can stretch it as wide as you want, but every question that is asked, there is an answer for it by the experts that can weigh upon it and provide society with the, at least how it's supposed to be dealt with. What happens, for instance, in this specific case that you say? How do you make sure that there's no copyright violation? It's a matter of law. You just make it the law of
Not
the
just that,
country.
but you have to create a system where,
of course,
songs are counted every time they're played on the radio. Somebody, or people gets a royalty. People get,
But what I'm saying is that, look, the mechanisms exist, the formulas exist, the laws exist. Now, how are you going to implement it in Iran? Of course, that will take some time to build in all the necessary infrastructure doing that. But conceptually and legally speaking, we're not reinventing the wheel. And there are models that can be successfully applied to Iran to make sure that Iranians also are not deprived of the same rights that artists in other countries benefit from because those laws are in place or that infrastructure is in place. That by itself is a challenge. But I much rather have this kind of challenge face our society, so we help build this modern country back together than worry about the fact that we cannot afford bread or we cannot hire employees because there's no power and I have to shut down my store and I cannot even survive. The kind of problem we have to deal now. Those are good problems to have. That are good problems to have, because at the end we'll get there. But it will not happen until we have the current situation continue. How many more victims do we want to have down the line?
Okay, a final couple of questions about legacy, and coming back to the people chanting your name and your grandfather's name and your dad's name. I rewatched that final interview that your dad did, the Shah of Iran, in I guess it was 1980 with David Frost in Panama.
Yes,
and that's the interview where he says, with remarkable prescience, says, history will judge me differently, and the truth always comes out. And you kind of watch it and you go, and he even says, somebody says 50 years, and and we're pretty much there now. Do you think that's happening now? That history is really judging your father differently, and do you think you're being judged differently too now?
Well, despite a severe restriction and repression that anybody voicing any favorable opinion or support opinion vis-a-vis me or my family face a severe reprimand by the regime. A lot of people are even afraid to come and like a post that I make on Instagram or elsewhere, because the regime will track them down and force them to either erase it or create problems for themselves. But that shows that sentiment exists. But again, one thing I'd like to say here is that, of course, I'm extremely humbled and honored to be perceived in such a way that they put in their faith and trust in me. But they should remember one thing: I never considered this to be about me. Everything I've done is for them, and it's about them. So if I can only be able to usher in that era that are desperate for, that's basically my mission in life.
A lot of your fans think it's about you. There's people,
but
certainly in social media, who think you're God.
They are entitled to their opinion, but I always remind them that don't put the carriage before the horse. We first have to get to that element where people are free. Then we'll see what happens. But I'm not here because I'm running for office or expect anything in return. I've done all of this only because your desire for freedom gets realized. And if you are putting your faith and trust in me to lead this movement so I can get you there, basically I'm the bridge to the other side of the river. And that's the role that I've defined for myself, and I've never thought beyond that. Let's get there first. And after we are free, then people are free to decide what they want next. I'm not thinking 10 steps down the line. I only want to make sure that we reach, brave this storm, reach the other side of the river. So then the Iranian people have absolute ultimate control as to how to want to defend their destiny. Therefore, I'm an agent for change, and that's why I'm playing this role, and that's why I've accepted the responsibility, because of that trust and faith that I put in me.
One of the questions that if somebody would say, well, what would you want to ask the Crown Prince? It would be this one. Sitting here, interviewing Iranians, talking to people around the world, interviewing people who are inside Iran as well over the last few years, it's very evident. It's not always fun to talk about, but it's very evident that a through line for all of us as Iranians around the world, regardless of geography and when we left Iran and age and gender, etc., is loss. We've lost a lot. Everybody's lost a lot through revolution, through war, through atrocities, through exile. And you've lost a lot. Your cousin, your advisor, your close advisor, your brother and sister, your country, your father. What have you learned about loss? And what do you say to your fellow Iranians about how we can overcome it? That's
a very philosophical, fundamental question. What motivates people to remain optimistic and determined, or simply give up. And I think, that's why I often weigh on the word hope, because hope, the way I translate it in my mind, is a desire of something people would like to have, but they're not sure whether they will ever attain it. And we are in a situation, I think, that, and factoring in everything you just said, all the pain, the suffering, the loss, and everything else, I guess that's the cost part of getting to where we want to be, that it doesn't fall from the sky. And in fact, because it has been so costly, reason more not to give up the fight. Otherwise, it would have been all in vain, right? But beyond having hope, and that's what I keep pressing as my message to my fellow compatriots, particularly today's young generation, is don't just hope, believe that you can actually get it done. And I'm not saying this, rhetorically. I actually believe that we can get it done. And we've done it before. We had done it before, where Iran was then and where it could have been now. And instead of being 50 years ahead, now we're 50 years behind everybody else, at the very least. How can we reduce the number of generations it will take to get back to where Iran should be ideally? And we can only minimize the cost or reduce that time of recovery by coming in full force. Therefore, the appeal that I have to my fellow compatriots is you have to start thinking beyond, we hope to have one day that freedom. We hope to have one day those abilities. Stop hoping, start believing.
Let me come to the hope and belief. But just before that, do you feel like you've gone through so much that you're somehow inoculated from feeling the effects of loss?
You could put it this way as well. But again, I've always been in my life someone who doesn't look back, always looks forward.
You do always say that.
Because I think that there's nothing you can do about what has happened. It has happened. There's nothing you can go back in time and change things. But you can do something about what's coming. So instead of looking back, I'd rather say, okay, what have I learned from it? What can I do this time that is not the repetition of the same mistake? What it is that I can do this time to learn from it? And it's a learning curve. Yes, Iranians have paid a very high price. But I think coming out of the tunnel, we're better for it because we have learned so much more. The simple realization of why it is so important to have a complete separation from religion from state as a prerequisite to democratic order was something that was impossible to teach or explain academically to our society with the mindset they had in 1979. But today they get it fully. They understand it so much better. And they would not have had this wisdom if they had not had to pay all of that price to understand the importance of it today. I think we could say that experience comes from mistake and wisdom comes from experience. And that wisdom is now more and more something that I can see in today's generation. When I compare today's Gen Z to the generation of 1979 of the same age, it's a completely different world. What were they thinking then? What they have learned so far? And therefore, how do they see what's their role in the future? And in these 44 years, all I've done is to try to keep that hope alive, that, what do you call it, mash'al,
a torch?
That torch alive, to be able to pass it to the next generation. But understanding again that the vision is looking forward, not back. And somehow culturally, we are a nation that often reminisces, often laments. And I think that every successful society that you see in the world today have ultimately been because they were visionary and pioneers. America here today is one of the reasons it's one of the leading democracies in the world, because the whole system was based on looking forward as pioneers and looking forward. So we are a society that long before America even existed, or half of Europe was civilized, established the first elements of civilization and culture and millenniums ago.
Yeah.
But in the 21st century, what are we going to do with it? What do we take with us forward? What is the future of our country and our culture and our
what to you is the
contributions?
difference between hope and belief?
Because belief means empowerment. Belief means that you actually believe that you can get it done, that you don't depend on external factors, that you have to understand that ultimately, if you want to be involved in everything that happens in your country, you cannot be on the side just observing. You have to participate. Participation is key. I mean, whether it's in politics or anything else, it's through participation that you maintain the course. And it's like, imagine a boat where nobody is at the wheel. And it doesn't have to always be one person or one limit. Everybody should consider a responsibility to keep things on track. It's a collective responsibility. We cannot always sit back and say the leader is ultimately responsible or government is only responsible. Citizens are also responsible. And if they believe in these abilities and that they have a role to play, that's when the difference is being made. So they're not passive observers, they are active participants. That's the difference between hoping passively and believing by being active participants. That's what I'm trying to do with my fellow compatriots. You can actually get it done. Don't underestimate your capabilities. And don't say, "Ah, pederamon dar omad," or I don't know, lehmon kardan. Yes, there are moments in history that happened. It's not the first time for Iranians. We were invaded and occupied by this, and we survived throughout centuries. Why? Because we never gave up on our identity and our sense of nationality. And today, that sentiment is at its strongest. You see it everywhere. But ultimately, to achieve what is the key question. So when you give them a roadmap, we tell them all of this is so that tomorrow you can have a better life, you can have a better future, you can have more prosperity, you will have your freedoms, you will have your opportunities. All of this takes a vision, a plan, and a belief that we can get it done. And that will be the difference in us succeeding or not succeeding. I'd rather believe that we will succeed because we're on the right side of history and are combated through versus an insane evil regime. And light always ultimately triumphs over darkness.
Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Jian.
There you go. Thank you to the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi for coming in and to his team for making this happen this past weekend. Hope you found that interesting. By all means, we're happy to hear your feedback on any of our platforms, or you can get in touch with us at info@roqemedia.com, info@roqemedia.com. And of course, to learn more about our show, check out our back episodes, our videos, our podcasts, etc. The hub of all things Roqe, the place to go is roqemedia.com. This is full time for Roqe for today, this special edition. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together each week. Super Parisa, Savvy Roham, Tina, the photo and video queen, and Charming Kimia, the CK. Special thanks to Smart Pega, Talented Anahita, Methodical Kave, and TRK, the Rising Keon, for all your help. Special thanks to Reza Sholay this past weekend, and Samin Ekbatoni for your help with the subtitles. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Do subscribe if you haven't done so already on any or all of our platforms. You can find the show on Instagram at Roqe Media. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. And as ever, don't forget, as we always say, Mizun Bashi.